Greetings, my name is Vytautas Malesh, currently of Wayne State University, and I am narrating this presentation on the rhetoric of waitstaff uniforms. This is part of a presentation on restaurant rhetorics with Dr. Lilian Mina of Auburn University at Montgomery and Mr. Adam Phillips of the University of South Florida. This presentation will focus on the uniforms of restaurant workers and waitstaff especially. I will begin by exploring the history of restaurant uniforms as a cultural extension of house servant uniforms deployed in the 18th and 19th century. I will then discuss varying types of restaurant uniforms and non-uniform costume in play in 21st century restaurants, followed by examples of communicative work performed by restaurant uniforms as they interface with diner audiences. Before delving into the history and rhetoric of restaurant uniforms, I'll take just a moment to describe my bearing on this project. I am presenting to you on the topic of sartorial rhetoric, which is a subset or close cousin of material rhetoric. As such, it is nonverbal, and consequently, when examining the signs and signals of a uniform, it is more helpful to look at cut, color, and other elements of design, as well as elements of deployment and hierarchy, rather than any verbiage on the uniform itself. As such verbiage is often reduced to little more than the name of the establishment and/or the name of the server, such omissions are easy to make and generally inconsequential, though exemptions persist, like the controversial and suggestive Hooters uniform with its attempt at a coy double entendre. My own work previously has involved dress in the white-collar workplace, and more exhaustively, the police uniform, which is the topic of my dissertation. In my scholarship on dress, and uniforms in particular, I primarily cite scholars already involved in the study of dress as communication. Such a bibliography includes Barry Brummett's A Rhetoric of Style, Malcolm Bernard's Fashion as Communication, and Fred Davis' Fashion, Culture, and Identity. Multiple scholars have written on dress specifically as rhetoric, namely Lyndall Buchanan, Carol Mattingly, Eugenia Policelli, and Irene Gunther. Similarly, a discussion of dress as a significant phenomenon must include Georg Simmel, Thorstein Veblen, and Roland Barthes. Interested viewers will find a short bibliography at the end of this presentation. The restaurant uniform is a descendant of the house servant uniform put into wide practice in the 19th century. Thorstein Veblen describes such uniforms accordingly. The wearing of uniforms or liveries implies a considerable degree of dependence and may even be said to be the mark of servitude, real or ostensible. The wearers of uniforms and liveries may be roughly divided into two classes, the free and the servile, or the noble and the ignoble. The uniforms of restaurant staffers likely fall into the second class, the ignoble, being a symbol of, as Veblen says, employments which properly fall to the industrious classes, such as handicraft or other productive labor, menial services, and the like. At a fundamental level, it seems reasonable that a waitperson's uniform continues to signal for servility. After all, servile and service, as in food service or server, are all essentially the same word. But servility, and as a consequence the uniform of the server, has complex connotations. We can of course take the sign at face value. A server's uniform suggests that they are present to provide service. Then again, we can continue to interrogate these terms. Judith Butler, for example, might ask if the server is a server because they serve, or if being called a server creates a person who serves. And in a more Marxist inquiry, we can ask what the social ramifications are for positions of servility, even those which we assume are taken voluntarily. In a database search conducted on February of 2018, restaurant and waitperson uniforms were a topic of only marginal interest. Although a search of the Wayne State University library system resulted in thousands of hits, most writings were of a trade nature, like David Lewis' article, Restaurant Trends Bode Well for Uniform Sales, published by the Advertising Specialty Institute, or Pat Patterson's Giving Your Restaurant a Uniform Appearance, published in Nation's Restaurant News. More rigorously tested documentation was still, in some sense, of a commercial nature. Clothing, Color, and Tipping, an attempted replication and extension by Michael Lynn, Michael Gabelhausen, and Sheila Garcia, published in the Journal of Hospitality and Tourism Research, surveyed over 1,000 respondents in order to determine if waitstaff in red clothing were considered more or less attractive and if they earned more or less money in tips. For the interested, the results were not quite conclusive, but leaned towards red being a good color choice. What I hope to do here is to consider how restaurant uniforms, in particular waitstaff uniforms, can do rhetorical work, whether for or against the interest of diners, waitstaff, and restaurant owners and operators. On the one hand, this still fledgling work may be of commercial interest to some of those above-mentioned parties because it echoes the existent literature on the topic, how to make good choices that help maximize profits out of customers. Diners, too, may wish to know the results of such work, as it would help them better read the apparel at work around them, so that they can determine for themselves whether or not they are being manipulated, pandered to, or served with a genuine interest in their positive dining experience. But most of all, I hope that I can continue to theorize the role that dress plays in society, and in the workplace in particular, by treating the restaurant as a locus for rhetorical delivery, which in turn excites the memory of an audience. In this case, diners. Here, I am looking at uniforms through what I call a canonical filter. More specifically, I'm treating uniforms as composed texts which go through 5 stages of composition, stages which are both non-discrete and recursive. This approach owes much to Dr. Sharon Crowley, whose methodical memory very clearly underscores the ways in which invention and memory circle back around on one another to inform rhetorical exchanges. I have already discussed something of the invention of the uniform via Thorstein Veblen's description of noble and ignoble uniformed workers. In order to illustrate that concept, I borrowed a screen capture from the popular TV series Downton Abbey, a show which capably demonstrates the relevance of the uniform to the next canon, arrangement. The staff of Downton Abbey suffer clear demarcations in class and rank, being designated as upper servants, like the butler, housekeeper, and valet, or lower servants, like the maids and footmen. Similar hierarchies exist in modern restaurants. Management may do the work of wait or kitchen staff, but it's usually an exception to the rule. Kitchen staff are back of the house, usually just abbreviated BOH, and servers, hosts and hostesses, maitre d's, and so on, are front of the house, FOH. Bussers are interesting liminal figures, doing back of the house work in the front of the house, but I digress. One of the first duties of restaurant clothing is to create a taxonomy. The first task of a restaurant uniform is to separate staff from diners, to clarify who works for whom. The restaurant uniform, then, arranges human beings into classes appropriate to function, the uniformed service personnel, and the diversely dressed clientele. One of the hazards faced by restaurant uniform designers, naturally, is that of over or under designing employee uniforms. Waiters in black jackets may very well be mistaken for valets, and excessively casual uniforming is likely to prompt a never-ending series of "Excuse me, do you work here?" inquiries. Thus, one of the first sites of rhetorical peril for restaurants is in the invention arrangement phase of garment design. In canonical listings, style usually comes after arrangement, but as you have no doubt observed, we have already set forth onto this ground when discussing arrangement. The color, the cut, the general fashion sense of the uniform is the province of style. Naturally, a uniform styled too similarly to that of a restaurant's customers provides for a degree of anxiety, as nobody can quite tell who is who. But to swing too wildly away from the desires of the diners is to stray too far from what is appropriate to the venue. The belletristic rhetorics, especially Hugh Blair, focused intensely on matters of taste. Blair described style as the peculiar manner in which a man expresses his conceptions by means of language different from mere language or words, that has some reference to an author's manner of thinking. Taste dictated style, and taste was something natural and common to all people, but which could be trained and refined such that one person's taste could be called superior to another's. Taste would also be a factor in determining appropriateness, especially the taste of the venue owner, as the Latinate roots of the word appropriate translate roughly to an addition to or extension of the property. Thus, the uniform becomes an expression of the restaurant owner's taste, and in so being, can begin to do real persuasive work. A diner may, through an observation of a waitstaff's uniform, begin to make transitive associations between an establishment's well-styled dress and similarly well-crafted food and drink. But of course, the restaurant's audience, the diners, must be capable of reading this sign language in order to make these determinations, and so memory comes into play. The uniform has the power to both make and to evoke memories. In the former case, a diner's first visit to a restaurant will create memories for future reference. In the latter case, subsequent visits to that restaurant should remind the diner of a pleasant initial contact. Or at least that's the logic behind branding, of which uniformed waitstaff are meant to be a key component. It seems rather obvious, but what is more subtle is the complicated way that memory interacts with signs in the world. Sharon Crowley's work on memory informs this point, as does emerging ecological scholarship. In summary, memories and communication do not work in straightforward lines. Rather, an object may trigger any number of memories in an observer, pleasant or no. Those memories are activated at the moment of delivery, when the clothed body of a waitstaffer comes into contact with the dining establishment. Whether or not that delivery is effective depends largely on the goals of the institution. Such goals may be defined as increasing customer satisfaction, increasing sales, or creating a professional appearance. These goals are as diverse as the institutions which make them up, though in my research the goals of any particular dress code are seldom explicitly stated. Instead, waitstaff goals and expectations, and by proxy the work which a uniform ideally extends, are often stated via implicit rather than explicit language. Sampling from the Wursthaus German deli and restaurant reveals language typical of the genre. Your overall image is our image. You make a distinct impression on each of our guests. The image you create can enhance or detract from our overall concept and the way our restaurant is perceived in the minds of our guests. But such language is typical because restaurants often use boilerplate employee handbooks rather than authoring any explicit rhetorical outcomes for themselves. In fact, Wursthaus's waitstaff training manual is really authored by RRG Consulting. Such language is also arguably contradictory. If a waitperson's overall image is also the restaurant's image, then how does the waitperson leave a distinct impression? Shouldn't the impression be rather blurry and homogenized? Consequently, with poorly defined goals, it's difficult to say that rhetorical work is really being done. Studies like that mentioned earlier, Clothing, Color, and Tipping by Lynn, Gabelhausen, and Garcia, may with careful consideration allow for empirical data proving some sort of cost-to-benefit metrics for restaurants. However, of similar interest to us is the way that uniforms succeed and fail as objects of communication beyond their intended role. I mentioned the Hooters uniform earlier in this presentation, a problematic costume since its inception for the controversy that has at times surrounded it. Comedian Chris Rock famously quipped in his 1999 comedy single No Sex in the Champagne Room that no one goes to Hooters for wings. Coupling the skimpy, creamsicle short outfits worn by Hooters servers with my previous points regarding the servility of costume staff, and the troubling implications of such servers as servile property are evident. Hooters inspired a somewhat comparable Dallas area restaurant in 2015 called Tallywhackers, which featured bare-chested, short-shorted men in place of Hooters' exclusively female servers. Tallywhackers closed in 2016 after only 1 year in business, but its existence proves the significance of Hooters and its iconic uniform beyond any short-term institutional goals of profit-making or hospitality. Also of interest are those moments when the uniform fails. A locus of examination for future work will be the success of the uniform in creating a uniform body out of disparate individual waitstaffers. There may be something in us that rejects uniformity. The ideology behind uniforming would seem to suggest that one waitperson ought to be interchangeable for another. But in popular entertainment, there's a persistent anxiety about uniforms. Shown here is a screen grab from the 2005 movie Waiting. While the actors depicted all wear uniforms appropriate to waitstaff, there are variations from character to character, both subtle and obvious. Even the kitchen staff of that same movie are depicted as non-uniform. The chef, sous chef, and dishwasher all have varying costumes, which on the one hand can signal rank, but which also serve to create visual distinction. Naturally, no discussion of waitstaff uniforming would be complete without at least a nod to Jennifer Aniston's character Joanna in 1999's Office Space. She's a character who defies uniformity by adhering only to the most bare minimum requirements laid out by her job, 15 pieces of flair. Perhaps even more interesting is the failure of the uniform to create a uniform body of waitstaff in the perception of restaurant guests. In August of 2017, server Samantha Heaton was refused a tip by a customer over a pro-LGBT tattoo, shown here. In place of a tip, the diner had written only that they wouldn't tip someone who didn't love Jesus. Here it is not necessarily the uniform that caused friction between waitstaff and a guest, but rather the inability of the uniform to contain any and all tropes of individuality or to disguise conflicting messages of community and identity. Server Alexandra Judd was similarly denied a tip in 2016. In this case, the diner wrote a Bible verse in place of a tip, an action broadly seen as homophobic. I reached out to Judd through Facebook, but did not receive a reply. My own probing into Ms. Judd's place of employment via Google image searches showed restaurant staff in plain clothes rather than uniforms, shown here. Comparing those cases to a perhaps more infamous incident suggests something unsettling. In 2013, server Dana Morales went virally famous after posting a credit card receipt signaling that she would not receive a tip on account of her sexuality. Ms. Morales, like the previous two servers, is gay. However, Ms. Morales' restaurant required a unisex uniform of black shirts and orange ties. Unlike the case of Ms. Heaton, Ms. Morales had no obvious visual signifiers of sexual identity. And unlike Ms. Judd, Ms. Morales wore a uniform. And unlike both of the previous servers, Ms. Morales was making up her story. She had received a tip and did not receive a threatening homophobic message as she had claimed. But the takeaway is more complicated than simply stating that uniforms decrease friction between waitstaff and diners. The restaurant uniform, based on what I have sampled here, creates a catch-22. Either the staffer relinquishes their identity in service to the proprietor, or they risk criticism and conflict with dining customers. The server is, as I have suggested before, in service to the property, along with the rather troubling connotations of ownership and servility that this notion suggests. For some, this may be an untroubling and unproblematic encounter. After all, the kitchen staff are compensated for their time and ostensibly engage in this owner and server relationship willingly. And furthermore, I have neglected to discuss the possibilities for connection and community that can come from a restaurant uniform, successful or no. I can only offer anecdotally that I have personally tipped extra because of an interesting tattoo, or a non-uniform t-shirt depicting a character from a favorite TV show or movie. What I hope I've done here is to begin to probe the communicative capacity, if not agency, of the restaurant uniform, and especially the uniforms of waitstaff. There are hazards associated with uniforming bodies. Such hazards are, I think, inherent in the pronouncement of the action itself. To uniform is to strip away, or at least to attempt to strip away, individual identity. The Latin root of the word uniform signifies an attempt to make a single, coherent body out of many individual bodies. Despite the apparent banality of the restaurant uniform, its ubiquity, its consistency, and its ready availability as an object of parody and ridicule, there are unsettling connotations of servitude, ownership, and suppression underneath its obligatory flair. While intended meaning placed in and around such garments is murky to say the least, the observable reaction to waitstaff by dining patrons are observable. Both intended meaning and consequential reaction could prove to be compelling areas of study. Again, I am Vytautas Malesh, and I would like to thank you for your time today. I apologize that I cannot attend in person, but if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions regarding this presentation, please contact me by email, vytautas@vytautasmalesh.com, or follow me on Twitter, @VytautasMalesh. On this slide, you will see a very short recommended reading list for anyone interested in sartorial rhetoric, and uniforms especially. Again, thank you, and please bus your own tables before you leave.